twisted road. Hit the mid-mile market, 17 years old. And I never saw the rainbow, much less a pot of gold. My first love was a wicked twisted road. My first love was a castle in the sky. Never thought I'd make it till I had the guts to try. Then I sat up in my tower while the whole world passed me by. My first love was a castle in the sky. First love was a fearless driving rain. If I scared to death, I thought I'd never see her face again. And they say God was crying, so I guess he felt my pain. My first love was a fearless driving rain.
Ooh, there's effective throat crack. Knock, knock. Donna. Donna, na 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 na. Batman. Welcome to the latest OLIO storytelling event, brought to you by the OLIO Storytelling Collective, Kneosha Writers Guild, and Kneosha Fusion. My name is Dave, and I'll be your MC tonight. A couple of housekeeping things to get out of the way before we begin. Bathrooms, there's one back here, and there's one upstairs. You go through that door next to the bar. The lengthy, long stairway. But, we are streaming live on the Worldwide Net, which means people all around the world are going to be able to watch this tonight. So it only means about 890 trillion people will be watching. So don't get nervous. Yeah. I thought before we start, I do the thank yous right now before I forget them. So I want to thank Steve Hawkins and all the folks here at Kneosha Fusion for making this event possible. I want to thank whoever invented this stupid telephone. My notes just disappeared on me. So, but I want to thank the founders of the OLIO Storytelling Collective, Jim Janus, Lisa Domowitz-Kless, Tom Clark, and John Bloner. This is what, the third or fourth year we've been doing this now? So, about 15 episodes, I think, give or take a few. So let's see, who else is I going to think? Kneosha Writers Guild. I guess that's it. Try one more time to get this up here. Okay, well, while this thing loads, we'll just get ourselves started. Our first storyteller tonight is an award-winning storyteller. He won to Lucy Beck, thanks. I knew you know. Lucy Beck Award in 1997. He's a retired kindergarten teacher from Zion, Illinois. And last week, about a week and a half ago, he gave a workshop at the Kneosha Writers Guild. And we had 26 people show up, which we normally have like 5 people show up at these things. And it was great, packed room. It's a wonderful workshop. He's the reason we're here, that there's so much passion and excitement around this. And while I catch my bearings here, I'm sure you'll be a lot smoother than I am right now. So, anyhow, forgive the terrible introduction, but welcome, Tom Clark.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Recently, all of us have been inundated by all kinds of news items, I'm sure, globally that affect us. And sometimes when you hear something on the news, it transports you back to an experience or something you have already heard or experienced yourself. That happened to me recently when I read about a certain president who wanted to build a wall between our country and Mexico. And I remembered that a number of years ago, in a different cultural time, my uncle, Bill, later in life, took a job as a border agent between the United States and Mexico. And all of us in Minnesota couldn't believe he was leaving us, to go down there, but he just found it to be an exciting experience. So, he told us about a time when he was watching for people coming through, and he was checking bags and whatever, and wanted to make sure that nobody was smuggling in something that they shouldn't. But again, this was 30 years ago, and probably they weren't looking for the kinds of things they were looking for now. But so he told us about this time. He was watching, and down the road to this border crossing came a man leading a donkey, and the donkey had 3 bundles of straw on its back. And the man came through and was searched and started to lead the donkey through, and my uncle said, "Wait a minute, what's in those bundles of straw?" And the man didn't say anything, and so my uncle started to gently look through the bundles of straw and see if there was anything hidden in there, and he couldn't find anything, so he invited the gentleman to go on his way. The next day, here comes the same gentleman leading the donkey toward the border, 3 bundles of straw on its back. So he searches the gentleman, and then he searches the bundles of straw a little more vigorously than he had searched them the day before. Couldn't find anything, so he said, "Be on your way." 3rd day, down the road comes the same gentleman with a donkey and 3 bundles of straw on his back. This time, Uncle Bill was not amused. He said, "Look, I know you're smuggling something. Now what is it?" And so he grabbed one of those bundles of straw off of the donkey's back, and he ripped it off, and he threw it on the ground, and he grabbed another one, and he threw it in the air, and he smashed all those bundles of straw with his feet, and he couldn't find anything. And he sent the gentleman and the donkey on their way. 4th day, here he comes again with the donkey. This time, 3 bundles of straw, and Uncle Bill was a little irate by this time, and so he ripped those bundles off and he threw one high and low and stomped around on them. Still couldn't find anything, anything that shouldn't be there. So he sent the gentleman on his way. This went on every day for an entire week. This went on for an entire month. This went on for an entire year. Every single day, the same gentleman led a donkey up the path, 3 bundles of straw on its back, and my Uncle Bill had lost all control. He was nuts about this. He knew something was going on, but he just couldn't figure out what it was. He asked the other agents to come over, and they all helped him shred that straw bundles, one after another. Nothing. And they sent the man on his way. Well, I told you that Uncle Bill was a little older when he took this job, and so he held it for a couple of years and then retired from it and was going to head back up to Minnesota. So after his last day of work, he slept in the next morning, then went down to the village square and had a nice tall cup of coffee, and that's when he heard a familiar voice. And he looked over and saw the gentleman who he had seen every day for almost 2 years. And he leaped over and said, "You, I know that you were smuggling something all that time, and I couldn't figure it out. What was it? You were smuggling something, weren't you?" And the man just smiled. "What was it?" he said. "What was it?" And the man leaned over and said, "Donkeys." And that's the truth, too.
Very good. Donkeys. Okay, I'm going to try to get this again. Okay, our next storyteller is a founding member of the WGTD radio players, where she's voiced countless characters and directed countless shows over the years. She's a reenactor of the annual Kneosha History Walks for the Greenridge Cemetery and active in community theater. But none of that matters compared to her crowning achievement, which was directing Tony Dow, that's right, Wally of the Beaver, in a play last year. So our little group has been touched by greatness. We've rubbed elbows with Tony Dow. So, without further ado, making her 4th or 5th appearance on the OLIO stage, Viki Dumez.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, I hobnob with the big stars. Standing on the corner, watching all the cars go by. Standing on the corner, watching all the cars go by. I am a crossing guard. I have a stop sign and a whistle, and I am authorized to use them both. I also have assistants, 5th graders. There's one 5th grader that has a very special place in my heart. Her name is Kiera. And Kiera and I would be at the corner, and we would tell tales and tell stories and make up stories. And like Lieutenant Columbo, I always kept in my pocket a little notebook and a pencil, and I took notes. And what I did was, I went home and I put all of our thoughts together into a story, and I'd like to share that story with you tonight. Okay, good. It was an unusual afternoon. It was January in Wisconsin, and it was 50 degrees. Viki was at the corner. Kiera ran to the corner, swinging her orange lunch tote, smiling as always. The afternoon shift went off without a hitch. After the work was all done and all the patrons had safely and securely crossed the street, Viki and Kiera then began to chit-chat as usual, chirping like little chickadees. The afternoon school traffic had trickled off and soon disappeared, as usual. It was a cloudless day, and the afternoon sun was bright in the sky. Kiera was facing 75th Street, the busier of the two streets. Viki faced Kiera. Suddenly, Kiera said, "Did you see that?" "See what?" Viki responded. "The sand bucket. The top moved." Viki spun around to see the yellow bucket. It stood silently across the street. It had one word, sand, printed in big, bold black letters across its midsection. "No, it didn't," she replied, using her hand to block the sun from her eyes. "Oh, yes, it did," Kiera said. "I saw it." "Well, I must have missed it while I had my back turned," said Viki. "Look, there it goes again!" Kiera was getting very excited, and she was bobbing up and down. Now this time, when Viki turned around, the lid of the sand bucket was slowly bumping up and down, swaying from side to side. It started slowly, but then began to build. The rattle that the lid made grew louder and louder and louder. Viki and Kiera looked at each other in stunned silence. The noise continued to build, very much like a tea kettle that's on top of the stove coming to a boil. The bucket itself then began to vibrate and shake. Suddenly, the bucket blew its top. It flipped its lid. The yellow plastic lid was tethered to the yellow plastic barrel by a very sturdy piece of yellow plastic rope. The pop lid made a very loud clanging sound as it hit what Viki and Kiera thought was the side of the bucket. Just then, the fire hydrant that lived next to the bucket started to hiss and hiss. The pop lid had crashed into the fire hydrant, and then the water began spurting wildly from the hydrant. It gushed everywhere, and a good deal of it ended up inside the sand bucket. The bucket then rocked back and forth and back and forth. It was now completely out of control. Water kept pouring frantically out of the hydrant, and Viki and Kiera stood motionless, watching this mayhem unfold across the street from them. They were much too frightened to talk, but they instantly knew what it was. The wet sand whirled and twirled and swirled rapidly inside the bucket. It formed what looked like a crooked arm, complete with spindly fingers. A loud whoosh was heard as it reached up out of the bowels of the bucket and grabbed the hydrant, smothering it in wet sand. The sand didn't stop there. Oh no. The arm of the sand snaked across the sidewalk, jumped up onto the branches with the bare bushes. The wet sand then traveled up the bushes with its spiny fingers and crushed the lower branches of the unsuspecting tree that was next to the bushes. It left nothing in its wake. It was taking no prisoners. It was upset. No, my friends, it was not upset. It was more than upset. It was very angry. It was ... the dreaded sand monster. On the corner across the street, Viki and Kiara were very scared. Of course the two had heard about the sand monster. It was somewhat of a Southport urban legend, but until that very day, neither of them had actually seen the beast until that day. The sand monster heard the girls from across the street. In a fury, it swirled around and faced the pair, its arms and fingers aimed directly at them. It had morphed now, and it had 2 arms with 2 hands and 2 sets of fingers. It was frightening, very frightening. It waved its limbs menacingly at the girls. They stood, they were frozen, and they wanted to let it go. They were dazed and confused by the beast's mesmerizing swirls. So soon they were staring directly at that sand monster. And then, as if they were zombies, they both began to walk woodenly across the street, directly toward the sand monster. Viki had her stop sign at her side, and her whistle hung loosely around her neck on its lanyard. They said nothing. This was very unusual. The sand monster had maliciously cast its evil spell on them and was crooking its finger at them to call them. But when they got across the street, the sand monster began to hiss and whirl and twirl and swirl all around them. It circled them both, striking at each girl, spinning them each around. Then Kiara spotted the speed limit 25 sign that was a few feet away. She willed herself free. When she broke from the spell, she broke free from the wet, sandy whirlpool and grabbed at that speed limit sign. She began tugging on it. She called to Viki, "Help me! Help me! Don't get caught up by him! Help me!" Kiara was not frantic at all. She was clear-headed, and she worked diligently at that speed limit sign. Hearing Kiara's familiar voice, Viki blinked her eyes and shook her head, and Kiara kept calling to her, come on, Viki, you can do it, I need your help." Kiara's words helped snap Viki out of her spell. Viki ran to the speed limit sign and began to push hard on one side as Kiara pulled just as hard on the other side. Push, push, pull, pull, push, pull. What a team they made. From time to time, one or other of the girls would take a hold of the sign and shake it from side to side as hard as she could. The sand monster, meantime, was still swirling and twirling and whirling all around them and striking at them. Viki took her own stop sign and began to use it as a shovel to move some of the wet dirt around the base of the speed limit sign. The hard work eventually paid off. The speed limit sign soon gave a little, and then even more. And then it broke free. Kiara was working on pure adrenaline at this time. She was not going to let that sand monster beat her or her friend Viki. She used what seemed like superhuman strength. It was like she was Wonder Woman. And she hoisted the speed limit sign out of the ground and up over her head. Now, Kiara is a petite girl, so this was incredible. She swung the uprooted sign wildly at the swirling sand monster. And the monster was stunned. Whoa, what just happened? It stopped in its tracks for merely a nanosecond. Then it lunged and hissed angrily at Kiara. Kiara was not afraid. She was determined. She whacked the monster from one side. She whacked it from the other. She whacked it again and again and again. And Viki blew her whistle shrilly. She picked up her stop sign and began swatting at the monster. Now, her stop sign was rather small. It was plastic and did not weigh nearly as much as the speed limit sign. But Viki swatted valiantly, trying to help Kiara. Kiara did the lion's share of the work. Soon the sand monster began to tire, and then it began to slowly shrink. It twirled itself in the opposite direction, gradually losing fingers, hands, and arms. Now shapeless, it slunk back into the yellow plastic bucket. The bucket oozed a few wet tears. Its wet mass let out a whimper. And it was over. The beast had given up. It had been defeated by the 2 traffic signs wielded by the 2 good friends. Viki replaced the lid. Kiara brushed her hands together and smiled broadly. "Well, that's that," she said. She confidently took Viki by the hand. They headed to the corner. Viki found her whistle. She was nervous. It took her a while. She put it in her mouth. She let go of Kiera's hand, and then she took a step off the curb, blew her whistle, walked into the crosswalk, held up her stop sign, outstretched her other arm. She looked over at Kiera and nodded, giving Kiera the signal for her to safely cross the street. And Kiera did just that, smiling all the way. Kiera's mom pulled up to the corner, as usual. Viki and Kiera said goodbye, as usual. Kiera happily jumped into the big white minivan, as usual. So, Kiera, how was your day? Did anything happen? Her mom asked. Kiera replied, nothing unusual. And the moral of the story is, always obey traffic signs.
That was very good. I didn't know where you're going for the longest time with that. That makes sense. I'm sorry. I'm sure you didn't anticipate watching some guy type on his phone all night. Okay, it's my great honor, and it's pretty darn exciting for me to welcome our next storyteller, the prodigal son of the Kneosha Writers Guild, Mr. Jim Janus. I like to think of Jim as something of a Renaissance man. And it's not just because of his proclivity for powdered wigs and fluffy shirts, but it's because he studied various forms of creative writing. He's written poetry and plays, studied with a renowned Chicago dramatist, and he's just very versatile, and he's written award-winning fiction. So please welcome back from the heart of darkness of the netherworld known as Illinois, Mr. Jim Janus.
Thanks, Dave, for that fun introduction. So here we are. It's April 2018 already, almost May 2018. 30 years ago, it was May 1988, and I graduated from college. So back then, I was 22 years old and still living at home with my parents. And I didn't have a job yet, mainly because I hadn't started looking for one. I was a little bit of a homebody, and that makes me think that when I would start looking for a job, one thing I didn't want is a job that would require me to travel. So that Monday in May after graduation, I was taking it pretty easy. At my mom and dad's house, I decided to sleep late. I was sleeping in. And the house was really quiet. It's my dad, he was at work. My couple of siblings, they were at work. My mom, well, she was in the house. And I'm sure she was thinking that I should be up looking for a job. So I mentioned the house was pretty quiet. It was, and then it changed. As I'm laying in bed, I can hear this sound in the distance within the house, like zzzz. And then it started getting a little closer and a little louder, like zzzz, zzzz. And then it got really loud. It was right by my door. I was like, it was the vacuum cleaner. This was my mom's way of motivating me. So I just waited for the sound to go away. I didn't get up. But now I was awake. So I'm laying there in bed and I'm thinking, okay, so I've got this degree in computer science. What should I do with it? And then I started thinking, why was I even interested in computers to begin with? So I started thinking back to these old science fiction movies that I liked. And you guys kind of remember the scene, like a general scene of a big laboratory with a wall-to-wall computer, big steel cabinets with these arrays of blinking lights of all different colors and all these knobs and switches and dials. And then there's the computer tones like a gurgling, bubbling. And then there's one guy, like a guy in this white lab coat, and he's looking at this printout that just came out of this machine with these rows of numbers on it. And he's scratching his head, and then he goes back to his keyboard to adjust something. That's the job that I wanted. Now, also in May 1988, there was a company called Wallace Computer Services, and they needed a computer programmer right away. So they called up a nearby university, Northern Illinois, and they talked to their computer science department and said, hey, do you have any recent graduates who are still looking for a job? So the department gave Wallace the name of the one guy who hadn't yet reported back that he got a job. So back to the Janus house on that May morning, after my mom finished vacuuming, the phone rang. And that was Wallace Computer Services calling my mom and dad's house to talk to me. So I went in, did the interview, they offered me the job. So my first day now at Wallace, they assigned me a desk. And so it's a desk, and it's got this big mainframe terminal on it, and then next to it's a telephone. And around this desk is a cubicle, 3 cubicle walls. And this cubicle is within this big room. And all around this big room are a bunch of other cubicles. There's no other computer equipment around. So Wallace Computer Services, their business was business forms. They sold and manufactured them. And my job was to write these computer programs that calculated their sales and profits. Well, I got pretty good at this, and I did a good job, and after a few years, they rewarded me by sending me on the road. In particular, they sent me to Tennessee, small town in Tennessee where they had a manufacturing plant. And this plant was in need of a computer system. But before they sent me down there, they wanted me to have a partner. They wanted a guy who was familiar with this mid-range kind of technology and somebody who could relate to the people in the plants. So they brought in this guy named Nick. And Nick, he was 32-year-old, divorced Italian from the south side of Chicago. He had this salt and pepper long hair that flowed over the back of his collar. And speaking of collar, when I look at this guy in his shirt and tie, he looked really awkward, like the manager of a grocery store. Oh yeah, and another thing, this guy had a Fu Manchu mustache. And whenever he talked, he swore all the time. If Nick was talking, he was swearing. So we knew right off that he and I were total opposites. But we hung out after work. So we're working there at Wallace Computer Services. We're not in Tennessee yet. And we'd go to this bar just a little ways down the road. We were in Hillside, just off of Roosevelt Road. So one night we go to the bar and we're both in my car. I'm driving, and the hardest thing you got to do is just get out of the parking lot and turn left on Roosevelt. Pretty tough to do during rush hour. There's a lot of traffic. So I'm in the driver's seat and I'm waiting for this big break in traffic so I can make the left turn. And Nick is getting more and more frustrated that I'm not taking advantage of these little breaks in the traffic that he thinks I can just shoot out in. So I'm waiting and waiting. He's getting more and more frustrated. Well, finally, I just turn right. And now we're headed away from the bar. And Nick is like, oh, I hate this. Well, then I saw there was no oncoming traffic, so I whipped the car into a U-turn, a successful U-turn, and then Nick is like, I love it. So we get over to this bar, Downey's Little Tavern. You have to step over this Irish wolfhound that's right in the doorway. And then there, Nick would tell me his little philosophies in life, like, when it comes to naked pictures, always take them, never give them. So we'd hang out together like that. Oh yeah, and I just thought of something. That exit coming out of the parking lot to Roosevelt Road, So again, this is Wallace Computer Services in Hillside, Illinois, just off Roosevelt Road. So Hillside's like this midpoint between the west side of Chicago and the affluent western suburbs. So on this road, Roosevelt Road, you can get all different types of characters driving back and forth. So as an example, one night around that same week, I step out of work, and so I step into the parking lot, and I notice there's a broken down car right by that exit to Roosevelt Road. So this is in the evening, and this is like an old car, like maybe a late 70s Buick Electra, this green color. And I can tell it's broken down because there's a big pool of antifreeze underneath it. And there's a woman standing next to it, like maybe in her 60s, and she looks kind of frazzled, and she's wearing this flower dress that looks like it's from the same era as the car. So, I want to help a little bit, so I walk over to her and ask her, like, hey, do you need, can I help? Do you need to use the phone or something? And she said, well, I'm trying to get back out to Wheaton, to my place in Wheaton, and I really don't know who to even call. Now, this lady didn't look too threatening, and at the time, I lived in Lombard, which was straight west on Roosevelt Road, just short of Wheaton. So I looked at her and I said, hey, that's the way I'm going. If you want, I can just drive you to your place. So she accepted my offer, got in the car, and we started on our way. Now, I don't remember too much about that conversation. I just remember that she seemed a little eccentric. And then I was thinking, like, hey, she lives in Wheaton. Maybe this lady's rich. Maybe this lady's got money. Maybe there's something in it for me other than, just doing a nice thing. So we're driving along. Well, then she starts talking to me about her boyfriend. His name's Bud. And Bud is a butcher. Well, after about 25 minutes, we get to Wheaton and we get to this lady's place. And it's not a mansion. It's like a really simple apartment complex. So I drop her off, and she says thank you, and she kind of apologizes for not, compensating me in any way. That's fine. So she goes on her way, and I head back home. Now let me jump in the story again. Let's get to the Tennessee part. So me and Nick, we finally get down to Tennessee. We're on our first trip to this plant. We're in the Memphis International Airport, and we got to rent a car. But first I want to mention that Nick did draw a little attention of the authorities, I guess probably because he was dressed in these long, like, camouflage pants, and he had a white Dago tee, and he's carrying this ridiculously large carry-on bag, and sticking out of it are the ends of all these computer cables. Well, we finally get to our rental car, and then Nick's like, oh, I think you should drive. I want to take a rest. It was a pretty early flight. We were both pretty tired. So he makes me drive this 60 miles southwest through the Tennessee flatlands. And we're driving along. He's resting. Well, he wakes up right when I'm entering Tipton County. And it was just in time for Nick to see this young woman along the side of the road walking. And she's got on these tight cutoffs and this short red top. And she's got her arm out and her thumb up. And I drive by her, and Nick starts yelling at me saying, pull over, pick her up. And I keep driving. He's like, what are you doing? You don't pass something up like that. Well, we finally get to the plant, and we get greeted by the plant manager, me and Nick. And the plant manager was kind of like hesitant on greeting us until Nick introduced himself, because we found out later, up until that point, the plant manager thought that I had picked up a hitchhiker. This was Nick, who I got to work with. So that was our first day in the plant, and our job was, that first day, just load the application onto the computer and then start doing a little testing, making sure things work. Well, instead what we did was we spent most of that day assembling tables that these computer terminals were going to go on. Well, we get through this day, we get to the end, and then Nick asks the plant manager, hey, is there any place around here to get a drink? And the plant manager says, yeah, there's two places. There's the Little Hatchie, and there's the High Cotton. He goes, I recommend going to the Little Hatchie. It's safer. Well, that night, now Nick wants to drive the rental car. I get in there with him, and we end up at the less safe High Cotton. So this place was a roadhouse, like Covington, Tennessee's in the middle of nowhere. It takes you an hour to get to, like, if you want to go to a respectable dinner. It's a roadhouse. Think like 1976, the movie Walking Tall, the story of Buford Pusser. Any of the establishments in that movie, that was like this, the High Cotton. So over in the corner is a pool table, and it's very poorly lit. The only illumination over this table is like this cord that's going up over a rafter. It's hanging down right into a bare incandescent bulb, like with a partial cage around it. It was a mechanic's lamp. That's how they lit up the pool table. So Nick and I would spend hours, playing pool with the locals, and then we would head back to our rooms over at the Days Inn Motel. Well, after about 10 days of that, pretty much doing the same thing every day and the same thing every night, we finally got phase 1 of this project done, and Wallace called us back to take a break, come back to Hillside for like a week. So now here we are back in Hillside, and I'm sitting at my desk, and it's in the afternoon. I'm working away at my computer, touching up some programs for when we go back out to Tennessee. And then I hear this voice behind me, a woman's voice that I didn't recognize. Jim? And I turn around. It's the lady from Wheaton. She's standing right there in the office behind me. Nobody else, nobody escorted her. She's just standing there. So I'm in shock. I stand up right away. And she says, I just wanted to thank you again for driving me home that night. And, I was about to say, how did you get in here or whatever. And she says, I want you to come out in the parking lot and meet Bud. So actually, I welcomed this idea because it was the one sure way I could make sure to get her out of the building. So I walked with her. We walk into the parking lot. Sure enough, there's that late 70s Buick Electra, and I could see somebody in a passenger seat. So I walk over to the passenger door. She brings me over there, opens up the door, and there's Bud. This guy, he's a little bit overweight. He's wearing like sweats and a dirty T-shirt, and he's got on this horn-rimmed glasses with really thick lenses. It doesn't look like he's all there. And he hands me this box, this carton, about that size, white carton. And the woman says, I told you that Bud's a butcher. We wanted you to have this. So go ahead and open it. So I take this carton and I kind of carefully lift the lid. The thing is totally unmarked. And inside are like 4 vacuum-packed frozen T-bones. I was still kind of freaked out about this whole thing, and so I just closed it and nicely said thank you, and I've got to get back into work now, and goodbye. So I headed back in to the building, and not far from the door was Nick. He was kind of looking out the window. And I'm like, well, how did she get in here? Did you let her in? And he looked at me and he said, I thought she was your mother. So a few more days went by. We got all prepared for the next Tennessee trip, and then there we are back in Covington, Tennessee. And we wrap up at the plant, do a lot of training, and on the last couple of days, I had to train 3rd shift. So I would come back pretty early in the morning to the hotel, like 8 o'clock or so, and then try to sleep. So on one of those last days, I'm back at the Days Inn Motel, trying to get some sleep. I'm laying in the bed and I'm starting to drift off. And then I hear in the hallway, this, it's getting a little louder, and then a little on the door. Somebody's vacuuming the hallway at the Days Inn. And then that just made me kind of sit back and think like, what was it that I did in college again? Why did I go to college? And how is it that I ended up in Covington, Tennessee with Nick? Thank you.
Very good, Jim. Those IT implementation projects are always always memorable. Okay, so the next storyteller, it's my honor and privilege to introduce him. He's really an idiot. And let me get his name here. Is that difficult to pronounce here? It's me. It's me. So here goes. You're just like your father. When I was very small, I heard this all the time, oftentimes from my aunts, most of the time from my mother. It was usually after I'd gotten into trouble of some sort, so it really wasn't meant as a compliment. But that didn't matter to me, because when I was small, I was, like many other small boys, my dad was my hero. When I was young, I thought there was nothing my dad couldn't do or hadn't done. He'd been everywhere, and he could fix anything. He was strong, he was smart, and best of all, he was funny. There's never been anyone who could make me laugh like my dad. I remember as a kid watching him interact with other adults, and it didn't take me long to notice that the other person was almost always smiling, if not laughing, at something my dad had said. He may have been scratching his head in confusion, because my dad had kind of a bizarre way of looking at the world, but you're almost always smiling and laughing. And it occurred to me at that young age that one of the best compliments you can give anybody, and it's certainly true of my dad, was his good company. I can't think of anyone who ever spent any time with my dad who didn't leave feeling better than after they arrived. So, my dad was a master storyteller. He would have loved this stuff. His occupation for the last 30, 35 years of his working life was an over-the-road truck driver. Now, let's just stop and think about that for a second. An over-the-road truck driver. Is that the stupidest job description you ever heard? Where in the hell else are you going to drive a big truck? It's like saying somebody's in an office accountant. So he drove semi-trucks, the big rigs, 18-wheelers, and he drove them by night. And as a truck driver, he knew he wasn't paid just for showing up at some destination. He wasn't paid, for example, for arriving in a terminal in Cleveland. No, he was paid instead for navigating all the miles between Milwaukee and Cleveland. He was paid for the journey, not the destination. And this knowledge of the road informed his storytelling. Those poor impatient souls who were in a rush for a conclusion or even a point to a story would wind up frustrated and confused. But those of us who learned to strap ourselves in and let my dad take us on the hidden off-ramps and meandering back roads of his mind, we'd find unexpected treasures that lay there as he'd take you on these tangents that had nothing to do with the original story. And he described in vivid detail people, places, even meals he ate, had nothing to do with the story. And just when thought he got to the point where he'd forgotten himself what the story was all about, he'd scratch the side of his head and stare off in the distance. And that was a signal we knew the punchline was coming, the payoff. And it was always so underwhelming that you couldn't help but laugh. And he'd laugh too. And one of the things I admired most about him is that he was always laughing at himself. If there was ever anyone who didn't take himself too seriously, it was my dad. Now, when I was young, my dad was my hero, as with many other young boys. And as I grew older, as many boys do, I began to notice flaws in my father. Same thing that, for example, that was sweet and charming at age 5, or age 14 was embarrassing. And as I grew older, still became an adult, I noticed other flaws in my father. For example, he was emotionally incomplete. Anything that demanded an honest emotional response, he struggled with, and he was very awkward with anything where he had to reveal a real emotion. And he had this really bad tendency of saying the most inappropriate things at the most inopportune times. Now don't get me wrong, I recognize these as just for what they were, minor character flaws. And I still loved him as much as I ever did. That continued unchanged. It's just that by now I was an adult and raising a family of my own, and I put away the need for heroes along with other childish things. Then in March of 1993, when I was 34 years old, my mom was diagnosed with inoperable brain cancer. And in November of the same year, my dad underwent emergency quadruple heart bypass surgery. That's a hell of a combination of words. I don't know if I got them in the right order or not, but quadruple bypass heart surgery, or heart quadruple, whatever. So in March of 94, my mom was hospitalized with a stroke. That signaled the beginning of the end. And they sent her home with a hospital bed to live out her final days in her familiar surroundings. So they installed a hospital bed in my mom and dad's, in the living room of my mom and dad's house up in northwestern Wisconsin. And my dad quickly took his favorite chair, his recliner, and he put it next to my mom's bedside, and he stood vigil over her day and night, sleeping in the chair. But my mom was deteriorating kind of rapidly. So my sister, Jenny, my sister-in-law, Sue, took leaves of absence from their jobs and their families and moved in with my mom and dad to help with the caregiving. So I was working 410s at the time, so I'd drive up either late Thursday night or early Friday morning and help out as much best I can, but the bulk of the caregiving was administered by my mom, by my dad, Sue and Jenny. So anyhow, so one week in mid-May, I think it was by now, my dad and I convinced Jenny and Sue to finally take a well-deserved break and go back and reconnect with their families and recharge for the home stretch that was waiting for us. And we figured that my dad and I could hold the fort down for 2 short days and one night. So Jenny and Sue left, and Saturday came. It was a beautiful day in May. Sun was shining. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous day, and my mom was in good spirits and relatively coherent, and she slept a lot. So no issues at all. That night, my dad was starting to nod off in his chair about 10 o'clock, and I was growing tired too, so I went to bed. So I went to bed, and I was saying my dad had his camper set up in the front yard by the driveway. So I was I was sleeping down there. We'd equipped the camper with this walkie-talkie gizmo that my wife and I got when our kids were small. And the thinking was that I'd hear any disturbance in the night, or my dad could call my name over that, and I'd be right up there to help. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to the staticky sound of my mom and dad's voices. And I quickly realized my mom was having one of her bad episodes. I had heard about these from Jenny and Sue, but I never witnessed any. And I got dressed and put my shoes on, and I remember reaching out, putting my hand on the doorknob of the camper. But as I listened to my increasingly agitated mother verbally assaulting my dad, I froze. I couldn't bear to see what I was hearing, and I froze. And strange musical interlude there, my phone. So anyhow, I listened on as my mother was getting more and more upset and emotional and agitated, and I just froze. I couldn't bear to see her like that. And my dad, meanwhile, same guy who was so emotionally incomplete, who always struggled at these situations. He was, frankly, he was amazing. He was calm, cool, never did call my name out. And he's patient. and he said and did absolute right things. And looking back on it years later, I'd recognize it for what I think it was, the purest and most perfect demonstration of love I've ever witnessed. But I didn't notice at the time. At the time, all I felt was shame. My dad eventually got my mom calmed down. After 5 or 10 minutes, that felt like 50 minutes or an hour. And so the walkie-talkie eventually got quiet until it was completely silent. And I let go of the doorknob and I tried to go back to bed. But there was no way I could sleep. I was consumed by shame and remorse for my inaction. So finally, about 5:30, the sun was up, and the walkie-talkie seemed to be staring at me like it was accusing me of my cowardice. So finally, I couldn't stand anymore. So I walked out of the camper, started up the driveway to my mom and dad's house. And I remember it was a beautiful morning. The sun was shining. It was making the dew on the grass kind of shine and sparkle. And there was the morning sound of songbirds just waking up. And I walked up the driveway, slowly made my way through the back door, through the kitchen, to the other end of my mom and dad's living room. We're on the opposite end. The sun was shining through the windows, bathing my mom in its light as she lay peacefully asleep in her bed. And there in his chair, the same place I'd left him the night before, with his hand on my mom's bed, about only a finger reach away from my mom, sat my dad, also peacefully asleep. And as I stood there in my mom and dad's living room, absorbing the quiet beauty of the moment and everything it represented, a funny thing happened to me. My dad became my hero again. Thank you. On that note, I think we'll stop for about a 15-minute break. I don't have any imparting words of wisdom, so.